If you're anything like me and spend a fair to excessive amount of time thinking about the world building in fictional settings, be it through video games, miniature war games, tabletop campaigns, or just analyzing pop culture in general, you have probably come across a trope that is known as the Planet of Heads. It is a common trope, both with its flaws and benefits, and perhaps a better alternative to it, as I hope to illustrate here. And for that, we will take a leaf out of one of the more obscure, yet nonetheless interesting books written in the last century. If that sounds interesting to you, then join me on this endeavor. And since I don't have a flashy intro beyond this, let us proceed at haste into the video proper. Firstly though, for those not familiar, a Planet of Heads is a trope that shows up a lot in science fiction stories. It describes a fictional planet or alien species that is entirely defined by a single trait. Everyone from that planet, species or culture metaphorically wears the same hat, a personality, role or ideology that defines them completely. Just look at Star Trek, for an example. You've got the Klingons, who all wear the Unreal Warrior hat, or the Vulcans, with their science and logic, or the Ferengi, with their commerce and greed. Each alien race tends to function like a walking metaphor, often reduced down to a single cultural dimension. Or let us think of Star Wars and its love for single biome planets, coming in the flavors of city, forest, ice, salt, and of course, lots and lots and lots of rough and coarse sand planets. And while sci-fi tends to be especially guilty of this, the trope can be easily spotted in other genres as well. Fantasy, for example, is full of obligatory lands of barbaric warrior cultures that like to fight, to the cloak and rapier adventure-friendly merchant republics or other vaguely Renaissance-inspired countries, and more dubious regimes usually run by a fanatical theocracy or arcane tyrants. Thus, I will seek to look at it from a more setting-agnostic standpoint here, especially since no matter the genre, the alleged shortcomings are the same either way, be it cultures and countries or entire planets and people. There is a tendency to stereotype what could be a more complex society, sometimes getting into feeling downright cartoonish or at least getting very repetitive quickly. A warrior society might fight, but why? What drives their view of the world? A head all too often only describes what they do, not why they do it, or how they perceive their existence. And while the trope can be rightfully criticized for being reductive or stereotypical, one could also raise the fair point that at the end of the day, all fictional storytelling involves some degree of abstraction, and that it's better to have concise and compelling rather than bloated and boring lore. There's also a certain power, an inherent appeal to archetypes, and not just when it comes to the writing of characters. So why not use that to your advantage on a larger scale? Even more so, when beyond just simplicity, the trope is used deliberately for the sake of satire or allegory, to explore social or philosophical themes and the interaction of cultures adhering to them through method of exaggeration. Again, Klingons, Vulcans, and Ferengi don't just represent alien cultures, but also different philosophical modes: honor, logic, capitalism. And it's not like that kind of reduction would be without precedent. Our own mythology, which we draw from so heavily for fiction, does it well enough. We don't need to know in detail about the marriage customs, tax policy, or advanced basket weaving techniques of the people of Atlantis to get the point Plato was making there about mortal hubris. Like the tip of a sharp blade, there can be a point to the reduction. As for myself, I would say that both arguments can ring true in my ears, but that line of thinking will obviously not help us reach a proper conclusion. When in doubt, I'd say it's the best move to go back to the sources, to the enormous treasure of history and mythology we already have. Drawing on those traditions usually makes for richer, more interesting stories, and time and again, the best examples in fiction prove just that. You might know Warhammer Fantasy, for example, which, while absolutely guilty of the exaggeration part, usually plays around with it enough to not be that reductive about it. And thus its method of drawing on historical culture, then dialing up all the bizarre parts to 11, and then finally setting them in its grim fantasy world of perilous adventure tends to work out rather well. Or let us think of the much beloved FromSoft games. With Bloodborne, apart from, as you surely know, delving into the works of New England's most prominent controversial catname enthusiast, also taking more than a few pages out of the at times quite wild history of early modern medicine. There you have both nods to early blood transfusions, but also the teachings of Galvanism. With, for an example, the cages around the heads of the Mensis scholars being very likely inspired by Faraday cages, or more recently, Elden Ring, heavily drawing on both imagery of Nordic mythology and Renaissance alchemy and its symbolisms, such as Marika and Raragon acting as the White Queen and Red King respectively, or a kind of Rebus figure among many others that could be named. And then there's the Elder Scrolls, which draws from a mix of Gnosticism, Hindu metaphysics, and, allegedly, a generous helping of recreational drug use. The lore isn't just deep, it's deeply weird, and that in the best way. And I would assert further that it is rewarding to take inspiration from both history and mythology and to not shy away, even if the ideas looked into seem outdated or the topics got into get uncomfortable, as human history can be. Surely, many ideas of the past are foreign, are deeply weird to us. And isn't exactly that the point if we try to look beyond our plate? And when it comes to our case of seeking to do better than the Planet of Heads without losing its appeal of drawing on concise archetypes, and its advantage in recognizability and giving species and cultures a defining red thread to play around with, a possible path of inspiration might be found in the works of a man named Oswald Spengler. Oswald Arnold Gottfried Spengler was a German thinker from the early 20th century, and thus, like quite a few of them, such as Ernst Jünger or Friedrich Nietzsche before both, he sits in the same somewhat uncomfortable position of him and his work being quite liked by some members of a certain regime, although that feeling wasn't particularly mutual on the part of any of them, with the latter one having died when the Austrian artist formerly known as Schicklgruber was still only 11 years old. Spengler himself was born back in 1880 into a wealthy but strict middle-class family. He was an anxious but rather imaginative young lad, entertaining his three sisters with fantastical tales of distant places and spending his time drawing up maps and writing histories of fictitious empires. Growing up, he spent most of his life in the Second German Empire, working first as a school teacher and later transitioning into a full-time writer. And while these pictures might give you the impression of him being a rather dour fellow, he personally preferred to call himself just a realist. He just generally thought that not only were things not going too well, but that civilization, especially Western civilization, was on the downswing. This wasn't just doom scrolling before bedtime, though. No, he dedicated a massive 2-volume work to this idea, titled The Decline of the West, or Der Untergang des Abendlandes, if you want the dramatic German version, and he started writing it back in the year of 1912. Well, I don't know how much of early 20th century German history you know, but suffice to say that the events of the next few years didn't exactly brighten his outlook on the world. World War I broke out in 1914, left Europe and especially Germany in shambles, and mere weeks before its official end in 1918, the first volume of his book hit the shelves. And it certainly didn't collect dust there for long. As soon as the German Empire had collapsed in defeat, the Kaiser had abdicated, and people were trying to make sense of everything they'd known before coming crashing down around them. So, ironically, grim as might have been, Spengler's timing was perfect, leading to his book becoming a smash hit, and him becoming quite famous at that. Living under the democratic Weimar Republic, Spengler was mostly known for not liking it all that much. And to be somewhat fair to him, neither did a lot of people at the time. Even if you weren't an absolute die-hard conservative like Spengler, if you had spent your whole life under the relative stability of the old empire, then watched your country lose a war, spiral into hyperinflation, and descend into regular street fights between armed communist and fascist militias, perhaps you might have also started wondering whether voting for one of the at times over 50 splinter parties on the ballot was really worth it. Allegedly, Spengler even was slightly involved in not one, but two, for that time, comparatively minor plots to topple the government, which both fiddled out rather quickly though and never really got beyond the planning phase. Pulling something of a reverse Austrian painter arc, after the failure of his political ambitions, Spengler gave them up and dedicated himself solely to his academic pursuits. In his case, ultimately it is rather difficult to cast him as a vibrant revolutionary, radical ideologue, or hateful bigot of those days. While in a rather weird and, by today's standards, likely condescending way, he even was somewhat of an early cultural relativist who thought that it was important to understand different cultures on their own terms. He, quite frankly, was mostly just an old-fashioned elitist that disliked democracy by principle. He thought that the masses were firstly simply not capable of meaningful self-rule, secondly, easily manipulated by politicians and thus shouldn't be given power, and following that, thirdly, that the current situation of Germany would not lead to anything good. And well, I don't know either how much of mid-20th century German history you know, but let us just say that in this instance the events that followed didn't exactly prove him wrong on the latter prediction. When the big mustache man of the mid-century and his minions came into power, Spengler wasn't exactly impressed. Sure, quite a few people in their circles admired him, and some of his ideas were attractive to their movement, but to him they were too vulgar, too anti-intellectual, nor did he like their racial ideology, and so he dismissed them as a brutal and stupid bunch in his private letters. And in 1933, he even went so far as to publicly criticize them in his new book called The Hour of Decision. Needless to say, this didn't sit well with the gang of Hugo Boss appreciators. They branded him as Evic Gastric, an eternal yesterday's man stuck in the past, banning his writings from being taught and pushing him out of the public intellectual space. And while he was never attacked or imprisoned by them, after he died in 1936 of a heart attack, there were some rumors floating around that maybe the powers that be had chosen to help him along, although those were never substantiated. Today, Spengler remains mostly ignored by academia at large, both for his difficult, poetic style and the absolute ideological minefield that surrounds his work. He is mostly remembered for the decline of the West and its ideas. And if we look closer at them, especially his idea of prime symbols, you might find a surprisingly rich tool for understanding and building whole civilizations. And so that will be what we are delving into next. To give you both an absolutely breakneck breakdown of his monumental work and in interest of this video's runtime demonstrate the value of abstraction and at times I'm afraid oversimplification, let me just give you the basics restored. To put it simple, where many people imagine history as a linear process of continual progress, going from ancient to medieval and modern times with new discoveries leading the way, a forward development with perhaps some hiccups here and there, Spengler on the other hand had a different view. He argued that history seemed to be a process of cyclical nature, one of tales of rise and fall, growth and decline, and that this held particularly true for human societies. To him, they were just as living organisms that would be born, blossom, bloom, and then wither away and die. He rejected both the idea of a singular linear history of humanity, as its at the time Eurocentric leaning, and instead saw the histories of different people, a set of multiple and simultaneous yet separate life cycles, each with its own shape, logic, and timetable. Yet all of them are driven by the pursuit of certain goals, vibrant and full of vitality and creative force in their rise towards them in their formative youth, at which point Spengler calls them culture. From there, they go on to fully realize and codify their core ideas when they reach their height, but as they have reached their zenith and fully expressed those ideas in their myths, art, and philosophy, they start slowly to turn inward. Now they have become what Spengler in Separation from Culture calls civilization, reaching a more mechanical phase of urbanization and standardization, institutions, administrations, and worldly domination, technologically powerful, but spiritually spent. Then they start to cool down, to age and decline, though not in the form of a sharp apocalypse, but a slow winter rather, and then meet their end. Or, as Spengler less pessimistically called it, their Vollendung, their completion, consumption, or fulfillment, having been everything that could have been, except to finally not be anymore. And sure, from your highest point, your zenith, all directions you can go are downward. You might think every day about the Roman Empire, like to imagine how the world would look like had it not fallen, but could it then today still be the Roman Empire that we know? Or was it even still Rome when it fell, when the days of the Republic were only a distant memory? And in Spengler's view, every civilization will face its winter eventually, just as Rome did after its century of empire building. From this, though, he thought that you could aptly identify and compare key moments and figures in their development. To him, Napoleon and Caesar, or the Punic Wars and World War I, occupied the same spot within different cycles of different cultures. Yet, and this point was important to him, all those cultures he considered untransmutable. Sure, different cultures might interact and influence each other. You yourself might learn about a culture and learn to love it, perhaps even gaining a deeper understanding of it. But just like its language is not native to you, you don't possess the immanent instinctual understanding of a person that grew up in its waters, and the same inward disposition towards its deepest aspects, those certain goals and core ideas mentioned earlier, nascent forces driving all cultures, striving towards and guided by their heart and soul, what he called their prime symbols. These prime symbols were a culture's inner compass, its foundational image, with every artifact and idea pointing towards it, dictating the style of every expression and setting the tone for all their politic, art, and science, not just reflected outward in their works, but the very lens through which they saw the world. And of them, Spengler roughly divides world history so far into about 8 high cultures, with the 9th one emerging, each with their own prime symbol. To go over the most often discussed examples, one was the Apollonian culture, including both the ancient Greeks and Romans, with their prime symbol being the body and nearby space, often bound to the work of art, finite in its form and living in the present. Think of their statues and buildings, their love of the measured proportion and solid clear forms, but also their science. For example, their mathematics, Euclidean geometry, and focus on concrete figures, imagining an ideal of a well-ordered cosmos. And yeah, if I learned anything in my time at university, then that those Greeks and Romans liked putting things into form, with honors bestowed and prestige gained seldom coming without inscription or statues to commemorate them. Although I often wondered why it even extended to people like Homer, who they had little idea on how he looked like or if he existed at all. The Spenglerian answer, I suppose, would be that to those of Apollonian soul who liked to represent prestige in visual forms, the author of Iliad and Odyssey simply could not go without proper commemoration, just as they did with other heroes, legends, and of course, their gods. And where depiction of the divine was natural to them, it was graven image to others, such as the Jewish and Arabic people and the early Christians, which to Spengler were all part of the Magian culture. They were spiritually more inward-focused, just like their prime symbol, the enclosed dome, recalling the cave, the voice, the prophet, hidden revelations, mind and soul, and light against darkness. Why else would their architecture, be it mosque or synagogue, emphasize domes and arches, or the enclosed interior, their communities guided by ancient sacred laws? And they have made such great advancements, particularly in the fields of astrology, astronomy, and alchemy, if not in their pursuit of hidden truths. So if the Apollonian cultures built their temples solid, strong, yet beautifully focusing on solid forms, and those of a Magian soul, like their domes, their adorned mystical interior a hidden world of its own, why do so many later churches move upward and rise high into the sky? Because they belong to the Faustian culture that arose in Europe, although its influence would spread far beyond its shores, and took after its prime symbol, which is the infinite reach of space. To Spengler, that impulse shows up everywhere, in Gothic cathedrals that thrust skyward, in Renaissance linear perspective that opens a vanishing horizon, and in the age of oceanic exploration, and in the science's hunger for abstraction. Think of calculus, projective geometry, and the formal mathematization of nature. The Faustian soul is always reaching, always turning edges into new frontiers, mapping farther, calculating deeper, and building higher. Yet it's not all glory and progress for the Faustian Europeans, as Spengler made sure to let them know, for he aptly chose the name from the literary figure of Faust, that scholar who sold his soul to the devil for boundless knowledge and power, just as the wish to explore and to dominate can become self-devouring. To rise until one rises to ruin, to climb until there is no air left to breathe, to tame and subjugate nature until Faustian man has tamed and subjugated himself, and has invented his mighty machines only to reduce himself to a mere cog in them. That is the blessing and the curse of the Faustian spirit, and the seed of both this rise and decline. And that decline was well on the horizon, as Spengler argued. For with the rise of the merchant capital classes and the advancing commercialization of society, the rise of the power of money, bureaucracy, and mass media, things were roughly headed the same way as in late Rome, and that at least by the 21st century, this would lead to more and more emergencies of that decline. With governments and the institutions becoming more rigid and tyrannical, the elites of society looking out only for themselves, and the rise of Caesarism, meaning that strongman politicians would seek to take the reins of power, the West would take its final journey over the next 200 years towards its inevitable end. Well, all that doom and gloom and perhaps mild case of existential dread sitting in aside, how can we actually use these ideas for our purposes? Firstly, I suppose, and hope it should be clear to see now why I took you on this nearly 13-minute long tangent about some grumpy old German reactionaries' ideas, and why they, not just as a history major, were immediately interesting to me when I first read of them. Whereas our heads for planets often overtly describe a group of people in a world, and to some degree particularly how they are seen, the prime symbols are intrinsically bound to describe as well how they see the world. And while Spengler's methodology in its pure form would likely be a bit too unwieldy to go by strictly for writing purposes, his ideas are still a wonderful set of mental guidelines to seek out. Even if you use them a bit more liberally or on smaller scales, broken down to individual species and peoples, or nations and kingdoms, whereas Spengler's point of course was to grant theory, they still work very well. And even if your symbols are a bit less abstract, they can still be the red thread of a culture, reflected in their thinking and in their creations, sometimes clearly seen and other times remaining obfuscated. What is encouraged here is a keener sense for when to show, when to tell, and perhaps just as importantly, when to neither show or tell, but hide those themes from plain sight. Just to give an example working for both fantasy and sci-fi stories, you could have the serpentine slivers of Scalia Magna, whose buildings are literal snake shapes, whose armor and clothing are made from snakes, or at least look like they are, and whose speech and gestures mimic hisses and undulating motions. And sure, it might as well be a good bit of campy fun, but it's not exactly deep, which might become boring, especially if every planet in the sector is a themed pet shop according to the chosen head. But let us still take the symbol of the snake and see how we can work with it as a prime symbol. And for this, choose an absolute classic. Now we could have the different peoples belonging to the Ouroborosian culture who see existence as a grand eternity of cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. They might favor winding patterns in their clothing, and their soldiers prefer scale armor, more subtly evoking their prime symbol's likeness. Their streets are more often serpentines instead of straightaways. Their buildings make more use of spiral staircases than usual, and perhaps their inner architecture has a tendency to be designed in a way where moving through a building often brings you back to where you started initially. A similar sense of return and recurrence could also shape other cultural practices, with their funerary rites deliberately mirroring birth ceremonies and so on. And while I'm not big enough into music or mathematics to give you a clear example there, if you want to be cheeky about it, you could have them use a way of writing that changes direction with each line, like a slithering snake. Which, while perhaps sounding strange at first, isn't even that far-fetched and was an actual thing in ancient Greece, called boustrophodon, literally as the ox turns. They are of course likened to the plowing of a field, which was a core part of their daily life. Suddenly, your scribes aren't just recording laws or poems, they are performing the cultural symbol every time they pick up a pen. In the same way, instead of a unifying force in the world being a very shiny yet generic people wearing their no doubt pompous element of light heads, we could lend them the prism as their prime symbol. A brilliant people whose prismatic soul leads to them taking inspiration from others and reflecting it in you, viewing truth as a multifaceted spectrum, emphasizing councils and coalitions, their architecture playing with not just light but its refraction, and their music favoring overlapping layered polyphonies of shared song. Be it by safe havens and their beacons, or starports guiding lightspeed travel, their scientific advances in, of course, optics, crystals, and wave theory could lend itself well to those purposes. Or you could have an ancient and more mysterious culture whose prime symbol is that of a spiral. Come to think of it, let's not go down that road. But I think you get the basic idea and where I'm going with it. And more so, why good old Oswald's theories struck such an interest with me. But even so, where does that leave us? Let's reiterate. Sure, the planet of Hess has its place by the virtue of its very abstraction, and for all its flaws, it does the job. You wouldn't confuse the Ferengi for the Vulcans, or the desert planet for the ice planet, and that's part of their charm. But if you want to go deeper than just the basic recognizable shape, Spengler's idea of prime symbols gives you a tool, one of reduction to some degree for sure, but so are all world-building exercises anyway, because you can't simulate every text code and dinner recipe, but it is a reduction with layers. One that gives you both the clarity coming with drawing on a concise archetype and the richness of a culture that feels like it could exist. So why don't you try it and don't just ask yourself what your next species, culture, nation or kingdom will look like and what they do, but through which lens they look and what core ideas drive their doing. For where the heads for planets will tell you that a culture or species is all about war, science or trade, the prime symbols will tell you what their war, science and trade are all about. Don't just give them another head, give them a soul. I hope you, dear viewer, or perhaps even viewers, if I am to be that lucky, have enjoyed the video. It has been an interesting experience for me to make it, and I'm curious to see the discussion in the comments and general resonance. I also have some other ideas in the back of my head, and might continue this format if there's interest in it. For you, I hope that the ideas discussed here will inspire you a bit and make your writing projects go as smooth as the historian's job market looks in this economy. You could also like the video if you did so and subscribe if you want to see more of them. In any case, thank you for watching.